watching your projects evolve over the last couple of weeks. A few of you have mentioned you feel like you're struggling, and I want to tell you that that's perfectly normal. Research requires putting together a lot of skills and pulling from a lot of different sources of information. It's not easy, but you're going to get better at it with practice, which is why we're sort of working on a mini proposal this semester. So I wanted to share with you some of my own struggles, concept maps, and talk to you about how I created them. These examples come from the many stages of my dissertation, including some more recent ones that I've been working on as I've been trying to turn it into articles, and some that go all the way back to the beginning. So, here we go. So here's the first one. It's actually just a table that brings together all of the different strands of the literature that I reviewed for my dissertation. So it's organized by column with the different literature, and then identifying different components in the rows. So this is something that I didn't do at the beginning of my research project. It's something that I wish people had told me to do. I had a lot of this in my head, but putting it all out here in this table makes it a lot clearer. So I'm just going to start with the who row. So the literature kind of describes that there's all these different kinds of people that need to be brought together. Depending on which literature, it's different groups. So the Cradle to Career Network literature says the right mix of the right stakeholders. Well, what does that mean? Different authors will say you need to have K-12, higher ed, pre-K, plus other groups. It really depends on the size and scope of your project. Collective Impact says you really need CEO level leaders, and which ones depend on geography. The Civic Capacity literature said you need CEO level leaders, and it depends on the policy arena. The Multi-Sector Partnership literature says you need organizations and sectors that have interdependence. Social movements say people come together if they share hearts and minds, and middle-class professionals who have time and resources to engage. And then lastly, community organizing is about bringing together low-income individuals and those without political power. And so in order to conceptualize all of these different things and put them into one category, I call this stakeholder mobilization. So in the next slide, we can see that stakeholder encompasses a lot of different things. And so I've broken them into three conceptual groups that are on the right here. So we have elites, which then I've listed different types of people you might find in that category. Middle-class professionals, again with a list, and grassroots with a list. And so when I have my stakeholder bubble in any of my other conceptual maps, I know that this is actually, that whole thing is in that one little orange bubble. So the second, let's go back for a second. The second is the why here. And my concept was shared understanding of local need. What really came out of across all the literature for me is that people need to develop some sort of shared understanding of what the problem is. And the social movement literature really sort of spoke to me with this idea of issue framing. So this slide here breaks down issue framing into 3 steps described in that literature: problem identification, potential solutions, and calls to action. And so underneath, I also had the technical name that the literature uses, but for the sake of, being able to communicate with other people, I've used sort of plain English. And then I filled in these bubbles with stuff from the Cradle to Career Network literature to start to bring the different pieces together. And so you can see the arrow underneath shows that the directionality of this relationship, moving from identification of educational and workforce problems with families, to potential solutions, schooling supports, family supports, and then this collection of other slogans, mottos, brandings, emotion that are used to call people to action. Well, calling people to action, is that mobilization? Oh, let's see, there's mobilization. So I have this green arrow that shows that once we've got our issue framing, we're then using it to call people to action and to mobilize them. So now we're sort of beginning to develop a cyclical relationship. And so I also have my stakeholder groups here on the left, which popped up. So one of my hypotheses in my dissertation was that who was mobilized really was going to have a big impact in how people identified problems and how they developed solutions. And so I wanted to add that into my diagram here. So we're starting to bring all these different pieces together. So this is an older version. This goes back to my proposal. So we still have mobilization, we still have issue framing, there's a relationship in between them with the words backbone organization in between. So this is a special kind of organization that helps cradle to career networks with their logistics, communications, data, and so based on the literature, I thought they would play a really important role in going back and forth between this mobilization and issue framing. And then we can see around mobilization, I have social networks and relational trust. So those are two things from my readings that I thought would impact mobilization of those little colored dots, which represent people. So this is the model that I used in my defense. It's a lot, there's a lot more going on. You can see in the mobilization, I've now added self-interest and shared values to networks and trust. And then I've also labeled these structural and functional social capital using words from the literature. The other orange box is another sort of facilitator, which is collective cognition and dynamic deliberation, which are also terms through the literature, basically describing how we get to shared understandings. My arrows are now a little bit more cyclical as opposed to sort of reciprocal. And then instead of ending in issue framing, it ends in theory of change development. And then the red boxes are different leaders and the roles that they play sort of in the different stages of this process. So it's a little bit messier and harder to understand. This version is a little bit cleaner, and now in between, I just have communication. Sort of going back through my literature, communication rose up as being sort of this main facilitator of how things get done. All right, now we have another sort of messy one, which is my most recent working model. I'm going to start on the left with the blue sort of interlocking circles here. So we can see the same keywords. We have mobilization, framing, theory of change. I've added structure in there and an action arrow. And then similarly, we have social networks, social capital, trust, self-interest, things that contribute to mobilization in those little green bubbles. And then the orange bubbles are external and internal knowledge and sense making. So I'm working on another paper that's focusing really on the framing, and those are some of the areas that I want to look at how people take information about their own communities and then information about these problems writ large and start to put them together in order to develop issue framing. And so on the right then we have this arrow that goes to communication, and essentially this is sort of blowing up that communication area and identifying that there's 4 different components: public, private, individual, and mass communication strategies, and that they also exist in this sort of cyclical framing and mobilization. And the part in the center, the blue bit in the center, comes from an article, and so I wanted to make sure I cited that. So it's a little bit about my thinking about how I developed these models, how I chose the words, what I put in them, how I start to draw out the relationships between the different words in my study, understanding how one word kind of can act as a basket for a lot of other words. And I think that's really the most clear, right? So stakeholders a basket, and inside of that basket, I have some sub-baskets, and inside of those sub-baskets are really specific things. And so I want you guys to start working towards, what are your baskets? How do you put your keywords into baskets and come up with some concepts and start linking them together? So these were all done in PowerPoint using mostly smart art. But there's other tools like Google that can help us start to do some of this work, identify our concepts, play around with their relationships, put things in different baskets, move them around.